The air in the sterile chamber was a perfect, recycled null. It carried no scent, no dust, no memory. It was the air of non-existence, the same air Asset 734 had breathed for as long as he could remember. He stood motionless at the center of the white room, the polished floor reflecting a distorted, elongated version of himself, a wraith in a grey tactical suit. His heart beat at a precise 62 beats per minute, a rhythm dictated by the chemical cocktail that dripped methodically into his veins from a port just below his collarbone. He was a machine of flesh and bone, honed to a razor's edge by the Directorate. He was their ghost, their scalpel, their final solution. The simulation around him dissolved, the holographic bodies of fallen guards flickering into pixels before vanishing into the pristine white. A perfect run. No witnesses, no errors, maximum efficiency, minimal expenditure of energy. The report would be flawless, as always. A voice, smooth as chilled glass, materialized in his mind, transmitted through the neural lace woven into the base of his skull. Asset 734. Report to Briefing Room Gamma. It was Ilara, his handler, his creator. Her voice was the only constant in the void of his existence, the metronome to which his life was set. He did not reply. Acknowledgement was inefficient. He simply moved, his steps silent on the immaculate floor, a phantom gliding through the arteries of the Directorate's facility. The corridors were the same seamless white, bathed in a cold, blue-white light that bleached all color from the world. There were no windows. The outside was a concept, not a reality. The Directorate was a self-contained universe of order and control, and he was its most perfect instrument. He was not an asset, he was a system, a function. The distinction was critical. In Briefing Room Gamma, Ilara was a hologram, a shimmering column of light and data that gave the impression of a woman in a severe, high-collared uniform. Her face was a mask of placid authority. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply was. Asset 734, she began, her voice devoid of inflection. A new directive has been issued. Priority Alpha. A screen materialized beside her, displaying the face of a man. It was a candid shot, likely taken by a long-range drone. The man was dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to hold a weary intelligence. There was an unruly quality to him, a sense of gravity that even the grainy image could not erase. He was not smiling, but the lines around his eyes suggested he knew how. This is Reese Valerius, classification Alpha Prime. He is the leader of the ideological insurgency known as the Free Territories. He preaches a doctrine of biological essentialism, advocating for a return to what he calls natural dynamics. He is a destabilizing agent of the highest order. Kale, the name was a ghost on his tongue, a relic of a life before the White Rooms, a name he was forbidden to use, absorbed the data. Reese Valerius. The face was unsettling. It was a human face, not a collection of threat metrics. There was a warmth in the image that the Directorate's cold light could not extinguish. He suppressed the flicker of cognitive dissonance. It was irrelevant data. His organization has established a fortified settlement in the Greywater Wilds, beyond the jurisdiction of the Accord. They are attracting defectors, rogue elements, and other biological deviants. They represent a fundamental threat to the system's stability. Ilara's hologram flickered, as if in distaste. Valerius has cultivated a messianic persona. He offers sanctuary to those who cannot or will not integrate. He champions emotional chaos and physiological regression as virtues. The mission parameters scrolled across the screen. Infiltration, proximity, termination. You will be deployed under the guise of an Omega refugee seeking asylum. Your physiological markers have been temporarily altered to present as a late manifesting, unregistered Omega. Your scent profile has been calibrated to be appealingly neutral, submissive. The word hung in the sterile air, a foreign object. Kale's entire existence was predicated on the eradication of that concept. His Omega biology was a flaw, a bug in the system that had been ruthlessly suppressed, medicated, and conditioned into non-existence. He was a weapon, not a prize. Your suppressants will be replaced with a low-dose variable inhibitor. It will allow for a baseline biological reading by their scanners without triggering a full heat cycle. You will be vulnerable, asset. Do you understand? Understood. Kale's voice was a low rasp, unused to forming words. He communicated primarily through data transfer and mission execution. The vulnerability is the key to your infiltration. Omegas are a protected class within their primitive social structure. Valerius, for all his rhetoric of freedom, is an alpha. He will be susceptible to the instinctual drivers he claims to revere. You will exploit this. You will gain his trust. You will get close to him. And when the tactical window presents itself, you will sever the head of the insurgency. The termination method was a specialized neurotoxin delivered via a contact vector, a simple touch, a brush of skin against skin, intimate, efficient. Ilara's image wavered. There is one complication. Valerius is a prime alpha. His pheromonal output is exceptionally potent. Even with the inhibitors, you may experience biological feedback, disorientation, emotional resonance. This is to be considered an environmental hazard. You will monitor it. You will control it. You will not succumb to it. Her voice was a blade sharpening its edge. You are the culmination of the Ascendance program, Asset 734. You are pure function. You have been purged of the weakness inherent in your biology. Remember your conditioning. Emotion is a malfunction. Instinct is a cage. You are free of both. He nodded, a single, precise inclination of his head. He felt nothing. Not fear, not anticipation. Only the cool, clean hum of the system running its course. He was a line of code about to be executed. His purpose was clear. He would go into the wild, chaotic world of Rhys Valerius. He would wear the mask of the creature he was trained to despise. He would become a shadow in the heart of the rebellion, and he would extinguish its light. The final slide appeared on the screen. It was a transport schematic. Departure in 3 hours. He turned to leave, his mission already a living part of him, a cold, hard knot in the center of his being. As he reached the door, Ilara's voice stopped him, softer than before, a sliver of something almost human breaking through the synthesized calm. Kale. The sound of his forgotten name was a physical blow, a ghost touch against his skin. He froze, his hand hovering over the door panel. He did not turn. "Do not fail," she said, the warmth gone, the blade back in her voice. "There is no place for you to return to if you do." The door hissed open, and he stepped back into the white hall, the echo of a name he didn't own, chasing him down the long, silent corridor. He was not Kale. He was Asset 734, and he was being sent to destroy an alpha he had never met, in a world he could not imagine. The mission was everything. It had to be, because beyond it, there was only the null. The transport shuddered, a final lurch of mechanics before settling into silence. The rear ramp whined as it lowered, revealing not a sterile docking bay, but a wall of suffocating green. The air that rushed in was an assault. It was thick, wet, and overwhelmingly alive. It smelled of damp earth, of decaying leaves, of pollen and pine, and 1,000 other things Kale had no names for. It was a chaotic symphony of scent that crashed against the sterile null of his upbringing. And for a moment, his meticulously controlled systems faltered. His lungs seized. His heart rate, for the first time in years, spiked without a chemical prompt. He could feel the low-dose inhibitor struggling against the sudden, overwhelming sensory input. This was the grey water wilds. This was the edge of the map. He forced his body into compliance, stepping down the ramp onto soft, yielding ground. The grey tactical suit he had worn for his entire life had been replaced with simple, rough-spun clothes, a loose tunic and trousers, the colour of dirt. They felt alien against his skin, abrasive and real. Ilara's voice was a pinprick of familiar cold in the riot of new sensations. Sensory input is within expected parameters. Proceed to the rendezvous point. Maintain cover. He moved through the trees, his steps, for the first time, making noise. Leaves crunched under his boots. Twigs snapped. He felt clumsy, loud, a foreign object in a world that hummed with its own secret rhythms. The light here was different too, not the flat, shadowless glare of the directorate, but a dappled, shifting green gold that filtered through a high canopy of leaves. It was alive. It moved. It made the world a mosaic of light and shadow, constantly changing, impossible to fully map. He followed the encrypted path on his retinal display, a thin blue line guiding him through the wilderness. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, and he heard it, the low thrum of voices, the distant clang of a hammer on metal, the smell of wood smoke. He emerged from the forest into a large clearing. The settlement, Rhys Valerius's sanctuary, was not the fortified military compound he had expected. It was a sprawling, chaotic collection of buildings that seemed to have grown out of the earth itself. Structures of wood and stone and salvaged metal were clustered around a central plaza, connected by muddy paths. People moved everywhere, their clothes as varied and mismatched as the buildings. There were no uniforms, no visible signs of rank. There was only life. Laughter erupted from a group of people gathered around a fire pit. A child chased a dog down a path, squealing with delight. An older beta was tending a garden, his hands buried deep in the dark, rich soil. Kyle's conditioning screamed at the inefficiency, the lack of order, the sheer, unadulterated mess of it all. This was the chaos Ilara had spoken of, but it did not feel dangerous. It felt warm. As he approached the edge of the settlement, 2 guards stepped forward to intercept him. They were not wearing armor, just practical leather vests over their clothes. One was a broad-shouldered alpha, his scent a sharp, clean smell of cedar and ozone. The other was a lithe, watchful beta. The alpha's eyes scanned Kyle from head to toe, his gaze lingering for a moment on the pale skin of his neck where a scent gland would be. Kyle kept his head down, his posture deliberately submissive, a carefully rehearsed performance of fear and exhaustion. "State your name and purpose," the alpha said, his voice a low rumble. I am looking for sanctuary," Kyle murmured, his voice pitched to sound fragile. I heard this was a place where people could be free." The beta snorted softly. "We get a lot of people who've heard things. Where are you from?" "The outer zones," Kyle said, using the prepared backstory. "Sector Gamma 9, Iran. They were going to register me." He let a tremor enter his voice, a calculated display of vulnerability. The alpha's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. The instinctual drive to protect, just as the mission profile had predicted. "Another one," the alpha said to the beta, his voice lower now. "The directorate is getting bolder." He turned back to Kale. "We'll have to scan you. Standard procedure." Kyle nodded, feigning reluctance. The beta produced a handheld device and ran it over his body. Kyle watched the readings on the man's datapad from the corner of his eye. His heart rate was elevated, his body temperature slightly low. The variable inhibitor was holding, presenting the biological markers of a stressed, unregistered omega. The device beeped over his neck. Pheromonal signature detected. Classification: omega. Unbonded. Suppressant traces present. Low level. Perfect. The beta gave the alpha a curt nod. The alpha's posture relaxed. "All right, you can enter. Someone will show you to the temporary quarters. You'll need to speak with Reese." The name was spoken with a reverence that bordered on religious. As the guards escorted him into the heart of the settlement, Kale felt hundreds of eyes on him. He felt their sense, a bewildering collage of alpha, beta, and a few other fainter omega signatures. It was a dizzying, nauseating experience. His meticulously ordered world of one had been shattered and replaced by a universe of many. He kept his gaze fixed on the muddy ground, playing the part of the frightened refugee. And then he felt it. A sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the clearing, a silence that fell over the ambient noise, a presence. He looked up. Standing on the steps of the largest building, a longhouse built from massive timbers, was Reese Valerius. He was taller than his picture had suggested, broad-shouldered and solid, dressed in the same simple, practical clothes as everyone else. But there was nothing simple about the way he held himself. He radiated an authority that was absolute, yet unforced, a stillness that drew all energy toward him, and his scent. Kale's inhibitors, already strained, felt as if they had been hit by a physical force. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was deep, complex, and vast. It smelled of ancient forests after a storm, of rich soil and petrichor, of something wild and primal and utterly, terrifyingly real. It was the scent of a prime alpha, undiluted and sovereign. It bypassed his conditioning, his training, his very will, and struck a chord deep in the suppressed core of his biology, a note that had not been played in a lifetime. Reese's eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, met his across the plaza. He wasn't looking at a refugee. He wasn't looking at an omega. He was looking at him, Kyle, as if he could see straight through the layers of deception to the broken thing cowering beneath. In that moment, Kyle understood. This mission would not be as simple as the Directorate believed. This man was not just a target. He was a force of nature. And Kyle, the perfect, sterile instrument, had just walked into the heart of the storm. Kyle was assigned a small room in a communal longhouse, a space that was the antithesis of his Directorate cell. The walls were rough-hewn wood, the floor uneven. A simple cot with a wool blanket sat against one wall. There was a window, a real window, that looked out onto the bustling life of the settlement. The air was thick with the scent of stewed meat and damp wool and the lingering, omnipresent fragrance of the forest. It was a constant, low-grade assault on his senses, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He spent the first 3 days in a state of heightened observation, his mind a cold, analytical machine, cataloguing every detail. He mapped the settlement's layout, noted the guard rotations, identified key personnel. He performed the menial tasks assigned to new arrivals, chopping vegetables in the communal kitchen, mending clothes in the workshop, with a quiet efficiency that drew few comments. He was a ghost here, too, but a different kind of ghost, not invisible, but overlooked. A frightened Omega boy, not worth a second glance. It was the perfect cover. He saw Rhys Valerius several times a day, always from a distance. The Alpha moved through the settlement with an easy grace, his presence a calming anchor in the chaotic life of the community. He spoke with everyone, from the children to the elders, his voice a low, steady murmur. He broke up a dispute between two hot-headed alphas with a few quiet words. He helped a woman carry a heavy basket of laundry, his large hands gentle. Kyle recorded every interaction, every gesture, searching for the tyrant, the fanatic Elara had described. He found only a leader who led by serving. The dissonance was a growing hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, a logical fallacy he couldn't resolve. The man on his screen and the man before his eyes were two different beings. On the evening of the third day, he was summoned. The same beta guard who had scanned him, a man named Finn, appeared at the door of his room. "Rhys will see you now," he said, his tone flat and suspicious. Finn had not been taken in by the Refugee Act. His gaze was sharp, analytical. He saw a discrepancy, even if he couldn't name it. Kale followed him to the main longhouse, the one Rhys had been standing on when he first arrived. The interior was vast and warm, lit by a great fire pit in the center. The air smelled of smoke, leather, and Rhys's grounding scent, which was so much stronger here in his own space. It saturated the very wood of the walls. Kyle's inhibitors pulsed, working overtime to keep his biology in check. Rhys was sitting in a worn leather chair near the fire, examining a piece of machinery. He looked up as Kyle entered, and the full force of his attention was like a physical touch. "Leave us, Finn," Rhys said, his voice calm. Finn hesitated, casting a distrustful glance at Kale before retreating, leaving them alone. "They call you Kale," Rhys said. It was not a question. Kale froze. He had given the name Wren to the guards, a simple, common name. He had not used the name Kale since he was a child, since before the White Rooms. How could he know? "That is not my name," Kyle said, his voice tight. Rhys set the piece of machinery aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The firelight carved shadows and highlights onto his face, making him look like something ancient and powerful. "Isn't it? It's the name I heard in the silence when I first saw you. A whisper, under all the fear you wear like a cloak." Kale's blood ran cold. Elara had warned him of emotional resonance. Was this it? A parlor trick? A lucky guess? "My name is Wren," he insisted, his training screaming at him to maintain the frame. Rhys smiled, a slow, sad smile. "Fear is a loud thing, but it doesn't have a name. What you have, it's a silence, a carefully constructed emptiness. It's much more interesting than fear." He gestured to a stool near the fire. "Sit. You look like you're about to shatter." Kale hesitated, then obeyed. The warmth of the fire was a shock to his skin, accustomed to the constant chill of the directorate. He sat rigidly, his hands clasped in his lap. "You say you're from the outer zones," Rhys continued, his voice soft, conversational. "Running from registration, a common enough story. But you don't move like someone from the zones. You move like someone who has been taught to make no sound at all. You are precise, economical, even when you are pretending to be clumsy." Kale's heart hammered against his ribs. He had been seen. The carefully constructed persona was already failing. "And your scent," Rhys added, his gaze intense. "It's like a room that's been scrubbed with bleach. There's nothing there. No history, no life, just a chemical blankness. What are they trying to hide under all that nothing?" Kyle said nothing. Denial was pointless. The Alpha saw too much. His mind raced, cycling through contingencies, escape protocols. But there was nowhere to run. He was exposed. "Who sent you?" Rhys asked, his voice still gentle, but with an underlying edge of steel. "The Directorate, I assume. They are the only ones with the technology and the lack of imagination to create something like you. Something like you." The phrase echoed Ilara's words. A tool, an asset, a thing. A sudden sharp memory flared in Kale's mind, unbidden. A training room. He was a boy, no older than 10. He had failed a task, a small hesitation. Ilara's voice, not in his head then, but cold and clear in the sterile room. "Emotion is a malfunction, 734. We will purge it. We will burn it out of you until only the function remains." He remembered the pain that followed, a white-hot agony from the disciplinary collar around his neck. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, but Rhys saw it. The Alpha's expression softened, the steel in his voice dissolving into something that looked unnervingly like pity. "They hurt you," Rhys said, his voice a low murmur. "They took a person and tried to turn him into a weapon. They broke you and then told you the broken pieces were a sign of your perfection." Kyle stared into the fire, the flames blurring through a sudden, shocking film of moisture in his eyes. He was not crying. He was incapable of crying. It was a physiological response to smoke irritation. It had to be. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. Rhys leaned back in his chair, a profound weariness settling over him. "I think you do," he said softly. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you're here? Are you going to finish your mission? Or are you going to start living your life?" The question hung in the warm, smoky air between them, a terrifying, exhilarating choice he never knew he had. The mission was termination. The alternative was a void, an unknown. For the first time, the void felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Rhys did not expose him. He did not confine him. He simply let him be. The day after their confrontation, Kale was reassigned from the kitchens to the perimeter sensor grid. The official reason was that his keen eye, noticed by Finn, would be an asset. The real reason was clear. Rhys was placing him in a position of trust, a calculated risk that was both a test and an offer. The work was complex, requiring focus and a deep understanding of technology. It was the kind of work Kale was built for. He spent his days in a small monitoring station at the edge of the settlement, maintaining the network of seismic, auditory, and electromagnetic sensors that served as the community's early warning system. It was solitary work, which was a relief. The constant proximity to so many people was exhausting, a drain on his carefully managed energy. Here, with only the hum of machinery and the sounds of the forest, he could almost feel a semblance of the sterile order he was used to. Finn was his supervisor. The suspicious Beta made no secret of his distrust. He would appear silently in the doorway of the station, his arms crossed, watching Kale work. "You learn fast," Finn commented one afternoon. His eyes narrowed. Almost too fast for a frightened refugee from the zones. Kale didn't look up from the diagnostic he was running. "I've always been good with machines," he said, his voice even. They make sense. They follow rules. People don't, Finn countered. You should remember that. Finn was a wall Kyle had to find a way around. He was Reese's shadow, his loyal right hand, and his suspicion was a constant threat to the mission. But it was not Finn who occupied Kale's thoughts. It was Reese. The Alpha would visit the station once a day, usually in the late afternoon. He would bring a flask of hot tea or a piece of fruit, simple offerings that felt monumental. He never mentioned their first conversation. He spoke of the weather, of the challenges of foraging in the dry season, of a new baby born in the settlement. He spoke of life. Kyle would listen, his responses clipped and minimal, but he listened. He watched the way Reese's eyes crinkled when he was amused, the way his large, capable hands gestured as he spoke. He was acutely aware of the Alpha's scent, that overwhelming fragrance of forest and storm which seemed to cling to the small station long after he left. It was seeping into Kyle's world, staining the edges of his sterile reality. One day, Reese found him staring at a schematic for a water purifier he was trying to repair. It was a directorate model, old but sophisticated. Having trouble? Reese asked, his voice pulling Kale from his concentration. The energy converter is failing, Kale said, pointing to a section of the diagram. The micro-fission core is unstable. It's a design flaw in this model. They overheat. Reese looked at him, a strange expression on his face. How would a boy from the outer zones know about the design flaws in a directorate fission core? He asked softly. Kyle froze. A mistake. A stupid, careless mistake. He had let his expertise show. He scrambled for a plausible lie. I scavenged parts. I read the manuals. Reese didn't push. He just nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Come with me, he said. There's something I want to show you. Kyle hesitated, his internal protocols screaming at him to refuse, to maintain distance. But he found himself standing and following the Alpha out of the station. Reese led him away from the settlement, deeper into the woods, along a path Kale hadn't known existed. The air grew cooler, damper. After a 10-minute walk, they came to a small, hidden clearing. In the center was a pool of water, startlingly clear, fed by a small waterfall that trickled down a rock face covered in moss. The air here was different, clean, and charged with negative ions. But it was the scent that made Kale stop in his tracks. Layered beneath the smell of water and wet stone was something else, something floral and sweet, yet achingly sad. The scent of an Omega. We lost her 3 months ago, Reese said, his voice low and heavy with grief. A directorate raid. She was one of our first. Found her half dead in the wastes. Her suppressants had failed and given her system shock. He looked at the pool, his eyes distant. Her name was Alia. She loved this place. She said the water was so clean it felt like it could wash away the past. Kyle stood frozen, the sweet, fading scent a lament in the air. He had never smelled a true Omega before, not one who wasn't chemically neutered like himself. The scent spoke of a life, of joy and sorrow, of a person who had existed and was now gone. It was a stark contrast to the chemical nothingness of his own scent. The directorate doesn't just suppress you, Reese said, turning to face him. They erase you. They take your name, your history, your very scent, and they replace it with a void. They tell you it's for your own good, for the sake of order. But it's not order, Kale. It's death, a slow, sterile death of the soul. He took a step closer. Kyle's body tensed, every instinct screaming at the proximity of the prime Alpha. The contact neurotoxin was in a micro-reservoir in the tip of his right index finger. A single touch to the man's exposed forearm was all it would take. The mission, termination. Elara's voice echoed in his memory. Sever the head of the insurgency. But his hand, resting at his side, felt impossibly heavy. He looked at Rhys's face, at the genuine sorrow in his eyes for the woman he had lost, at the weary strength that held a whole community together. He saw the man, not the target. "They did this to her," Rhys said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, raw with anger. "And they did it to you, and I will burn their whole system to the ground for it." The vehemence in his voice was terrifying, but it wasn't the fury of a fanatic. It was the righteous anger of a protector. In that moment, standing in a hidden sanctuary surrounded by the ghost scent of a dead Omega, Kale felt the first terrifying crack appear in the foundation of his world. The Directorate was order. The Directorate was stability. The Directorate was salvation. It was a lie. It was all a lie. He was not an asset. He was not a system. He was a casualty. And the man he was sent to kill was the only person who had ever seen it. The crack in his reality widened with each passing day. It was a hairline fracture at first, a subtle dissonance he could ignore. But Rhys's quiet, persistent humanity was like water, seeping into the fissure, freezing and expanding until the structure of Kale's conditioning began to groan under the strain. He continued his work at the sensor station, his focus a shield against the turmoil inside him. But the world was no longer a collection of data points. The dappled sunlight on the floor was no longer just a variable light pattern. It was warm. The scent of pine from the forest was not just an airborne particulate. It was clean and sharp and invigorating. These small sensory details were intrusions, glitches in his programming that he could not purge. His dreams, once blank and silent, were now filled with chaotic, disjointed images. The memory of a child's laughter in the settlement, the feel of rough-spun fabric against his skin, the image of Rhys's grey eyes, filled with a sorrow that Kale was beginning to understand. One afternoon, a patrol from the settlement skirmished with a Directorate drone scout near the southern perimeter. It was a minor incident, but it sent a ripple of tension through the community. Alarms blared, and people moved with a practiced urgency, securing the gates and taking up defensive positions. Kale's role was to track the drone's movements, to predict its path, and identify its model and capabilities from its energy signature. His hands flew over the console, his mind falling back into the familiar, comforting logic of tactical analysis. He was in his element, a predator tracking its prey. Rhys stood behind him in the small station, a silent, solid presence. Kale could feel the Alpha's calm, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the situation. He relayed coordinates, identified the drone as a high-speed reconnaissance model with limited offensive capabilities, and pinpointed its communication uplink. "If we can disable the uplink, we can capture it," Kyle said, his voice crisp and professional, the voice of Asset 734. Its data logs could give us information on Directorate patrol schedules. There was a moment of silence. Then Rhys's hand settled on his shoulder. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through Kale's entire system, a surge of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the first time anyone had touched him with casual reassurance in his entire life. Every touch he had ever known was clinical, painful, or simulated. This was warm, grounding. The neurotoxin in his finger felt 1,000,000 miles away. His breath hitched. His carefully constructed wall of detachment crumbled into dust. For a split second, he was not an asset. He was just a boy, starved for a simple human touch. Reese seemed to sense the cataclysmic effect of his gesture. He didn't remove his hand. He simply kept it there, a steady weight. "Good work, Kale," he said softly, and the use of his true name was not a shock this time, but a quiet affirmation. The drone was captured. The settlement celebrated the small victory. But Kale was reeling. He retreated to his room, the feeling of Reese's hand a phantom brand on his shoulder. He sat on his cot, staring at his hands, at the finger that held the power to kill the only person who had ever shown him kindness. Ilara's voice chose that moment to slice through his confusion, a shard of ice in his mind. "Report. You have been silent for 76 hours. Your proximity to the target is established. Why have you not acted?" The voice was sharp, accusatory. It felt more alien than ever, a sterile intrusion into the warm, messy world he now inhabited. "The tactical window has not presented itself," Kyle subvocalized, the lie feeling clumsy and thin. "The target exhibits a high level of situational awareness." "Your report is insufficient," Ilara's mental voice replied, laced with something that sounded like impatience. "The variable inhibitors are affecting your judgment. Your emotional responses are outside acceptable parameters." A wave of nausea rolled through him. The chemical cocktail in his blood felt sluggish, the inhibitors struggling against the constant, low-level pheromonal saturation of the settlement. He felt fuzzy, unfocused. The clean, sharp edges of his mind were blurring. He needed a purge. He needed the sterile white room and the cold, clean null. "You are compromised," Ilara stated, the words a death sentence. "A contingency has been activated. A supply drop will be made at the pre-arranged coordinates. It contains a full-dose suppressant and a neural recalibration unit. You will retrieve it and restore your operational parameters. Failure to comply will be interpreted as defection." The coordinates appeared in his retinal display, a point deep in the forest, a 12-hour walk from the settlement. The message was clear. Get back in line or be eliminated. The thought of the full-dose suppressant, of the cold clarity it would bring, was a siren's song. It promised a return to the familiar numbness, an escape from the terrifying, confusing emotions that were starting to bloom in the wasteland of his soul. But it also meant returning to being a thing, a tool. It meant seeing Reese not as a man, but as a target. It meant killing him. He looked out his small window. Night had fallen. The settlement was quiet, dotted with the warm, flickering lights of fires and lanterns. He could hear the low murmur of conversation from the longhouse, the distant sound of a flute playing a sad, sweet melody. This was chaos. This was inefficiency. This was everything he had been trained to destroy, and the thought of destroying it felt like destroying himself. His body was betraying him. The constant exposure to Reese's potent, grounding scent, combined with the low-dose inhibitor and the psychological stress of his fractured reality, was pushing his suppressed biology to its breaking point. It began as a subtle shift, a low thrum of heat under his skin that he tried to dismiss as fever. His thoughts grew sluggish, his focus splintering. The crisp logic of his training was dissolving into a fog of sensory input. The scent of baking bread from the kitchens was suddenly intoxicating. The rough texture of his wool blanket was an anchor in a swirling sea of disorientation. He was losing control. The mission to retrieve the recalibration unit from the supply drop was no longer a choice. It was a desperate necessity. He had to restore the order. He had to purge the chaos. He slipped out of the settlement before dawn, a ghost moving through the sleeping community. The forest was dark and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth he was leaving behind. Every step was an effort. The heat in his veins was intensifying, coiling in his gut like a hot snake. A deep, aching need began to bloom in the core of his being, a primal craving for something he couldn't name. He was halfway to the coordinates when it happened. A sudden, violent wave of heat washed over him, so intense it drove him to his knees. His vision swam. A sharp, sweet scent filled the air around him, a fragrance he had never smelled before. It was the scent of blooming nightshade and ozone, of something wild and desperate. It was his own scent, his true scent, breaking free from years of chemical imprisonment. The variable inhibitor had failed, utterly and catastrophically. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the feverish fog. This was it, the ultimate weakness, the biological flaw he had been conditioned to despise, now erupting without his consent. His body, his own flesh and blood, was in open rebellion. He had to hide. He scrambled off the path, crawling into a dense thicket of ferns, curling into a tight ball on the damp earth. The world narrowed to a whirlwind of sensation. The ache in his lower back became a deep, rhythmic pulse of pain. The heat was no longer just in his veins. It was a furnace radiating from his skin. This was a heat, his first heat. A biological event he had only read about in sterile medical texts, described as a primitive, degrading cycle of instinctual need. The texts had not described the loneliness, the terrifying, all-consuming loneliness of a body screaming for a connection it had been taught to abhor. He was coming apart, his carefully constructed identity dissolving in a fever of instinct. He was no longer Asset 734. He was not Kale. He was just a body, lost and in pain. Through the haze of fever, he heard footsteps on the path, heavy, steady footsteps. He held his breath, praying he wouldn't be found. The footsteps stopped. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then a low voice, laced with concern. Kale? It was Reese. Of course, it was Reese. The Alpha must have followed him. Or maybe he had scented him. The thought was mortifying. To be smelled like this, like an animal in distress. Reese's scent, rich and earthy, cut through the sweetness of Kale's own. It wasn't threatening. It was calming. A deep, resonant bass note that seemed to soothe the frantic, high-pitched frequency of his panic. "It's all right," Reese said, his voice closer now. He was pushing through the ferns. "I'm not going to hurt you." Kale squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the disgust, the dominance, the predatory instinct the files had described in alphas. He was helpless, a perfect target for exploitation. Reese knelt beside him. Kale could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But the alpha made no move to touch him. He simply knelt there, a silent, solid presence in the chaos of Kale's senses. "You're in heat," Reese stated, his voice gentle, factual, not an accusation, an observation. "Your suppressants must have failed." Kyle couldn't answer. He could only curl tighter, a wounded animal trying to make itself smaller. "Easy," Reese murmured. "Just breathe. I've got you." He didn't mean it literally. He still hadn't touched him. But Kale felt held. The overwhelming loneliness receded, pushed back by the sheer gravity of the Alpha's presence. Reese was creating a space for him, a pocket of calm in the storm of his body's betrayal. And in that space, something shifted. A new kind of connection opened, not sensory, but something deeper. It was as if a channel had been forced open in his mind, and through it he could feel Rhys, not his thoughts, but his emotions. A deep, steady well of concern, a fierce, protective anger directed not at Kale, but at whatever had done this to him. And beneath it all, a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored his own. It was a revelation that shattered the last remnants of his conditioning. He was not a weapon. He was not an experiment. He was a person, and this man, this target, this enemy, saw him. He saw the pain, the fear, the brokenness, and he did not turn away. He knelt in the dirt and offered him sanctuary. The last wall of Kyle's defense crumbled, and with a choked sob, he finally broke. The world dissolved into a fever dream. Time lost its meaning, stretching and compressing in a disorienting rhythm of pain and release. Kale was dimly aware of being moved, of strong arms lifting him with impossible gentleness. He remembered the scent of pine and earth surrounding him, a living shield against the world. He was carried back to the settlement, not to his own small room, but to Rhys's chambers in the main longhouse. The space was saturated with the alpha's grounding scent, and it was the only thing that kept him from spiraling into pure, instinctual panic. Rhys laid him on his own large bed, the furs and linens cool against his feverish skin. He left, and for a moment, terror seized Kale. The loneliness rushed back in, vast and terrifying. But Rhys returned moments later with a basin of cool water and cloths. He didn't speak. He simply began to bathe Kyle's face and neck, his movements slow and deliberate, his touch respectful. Each cool swipe of the cloth was an anchor, a point of focus in the raging storm of the heat. Kyle's mind was a chaotic landscape of sensation and memory. The clinical descriptions of an Omega's heat from his training files warred with the reality of it. The files spoke of weakness, of a loss of control, of a biological imperative for submission. They described it as a flaw to be eradicated. But this was not just weakness. It was a raw, primal power, a force of life so intense it was agonizing. His body was not just aching for a physical act, it was screaming for connection, for a bond, for an anchor to hold on to in the overwhelming tide of his own biology. And Rhys was not acting like the alphas in the files. There was no dominance in his posture, no predatory gleam in his eyes. There was only a deep, quiet reverence. He tended to Kale not as an object of desire, but as someone sacred. He was guarding him, protecting him not just from others, but from the terrifying intensity of his own experience. At the peak of the fever, when the pain and the need were a single, unbearable point of light in his mind, the psychic connection between them flared into brilliant life. It was no longer a vague sense of emotion. It was a torrent of shared consciousness. He saw through Rhys's eyes. He saw the settlement not as a chaotic mess, but as a fragile, beautiful tapestry of lives he had sworn to protect. He felt the weight of leadership, the constant, crushing burden of 1,000 hopes and fears resting on his shoulders. He saw memories, Rhys as a young man, watching the Directorate's sterile cities spread like a cancer across the landscape, suffocating the life out of the world. He saw the faces of people Rhys had lost, the Omegas and Betas and even Alphas who had been purged by the system for being different, for feeling too much, for not fitting into the neat, sterile boxes of the Accord. And then he saw himself. He saw Kale through Reese's eyes from that first moment in the plaza. Reese hadn't seen an Omega refugee. He had seen a ghost, a soul so deeply encased in ice that he could feel the cold from 100 feet away. He had seen a prisoner crying for help in a language of perfect, silent obedience. He had seen the name Kyle etched into that silence, a name that had been stolen but not erased. The truth, in its entirety, flooded Kyle's being. The Directorate had not saved him. They had stolen him. They had taken a child, an Omega child, and they had systematically, cruelly dismantled him, piece by piece, until only the function remained. They had told him he was free, but they had built him the most perfect cage imaginable, his own mind. Reese was not a terrorist. He was a liberator. He wasn't fighting to restore some primitive, chaotic past. He was fighting for a future where people could be whole. The realization was not a thought. It was a tectonic shift in the foundation of his soul. The lies he had been fed his entire life turned to dust, and in the empty space they left behind, a single, fragile truth began to grow. He was not a weapon. He was not broken. He was Kale, and he was in the arms of the only person who had ever known his name. As the fever finally began to recede, leaving him weak and trembling in the Alpha's bed, he looked at Reese, who was watching him with an expression of profound, weary tenderness. The mission was over, not failed, not aborted. It was simply irrelevant, a ghost from a life that was no longer his. He had been sent to destroy this man. Instead, this man had saved him from destroying himself. The world came back into focus slowly, piece by piece. The first thing he noticed was the silence, not the sterile, humming null of the Directorate, but a deep, peaceful quiet. The second was the weight of a heavy fur blanket over him. The third was the scent. Reese's scent was a gentle presence in the room now, not overwhelming, but a comforting, grounding baseline of pine and earth. The raging fire of the heat had banked to embers, leaving a deep, resonant ache in his bones and a profound sense of change. He felt scoured, clean, raw, but also strangely whole. He sat up, his movements stiff and slow. The clothes he was wearing were not his own. They were a soft, worn linen shirt that was far too large for him and smelled faintly of the Alpha. He looked around. He was still in Reese's chambers. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was simple, functional, filled with books and maps and strange mechanical objects. It was the room of a scholar and a builder, not a tyrant. He could feel the bond between them now, a tangible thing, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of his awareness. It wasn't a chain. It was a thread, a connection that felt right, natural. The door opened, and Reese entered, carrying a tray. He stopped when he saw Kale was awake, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Kale was no longer the hunter, and Reese was no longer the prey. They were something else entirely, something for which Kale had no name. "How do you feel?" Reese asked, his voice low. "Weak," Kyle answered, his own voice raspy, but clear. It was true. The fog of the suppressants and the fever was gone. For the first time in his memory, his mind felt like his own. He could feel his emotions, not as malfunctions, but as a part of him. There was fear, yes, a deep-seated terror of this new, unknown reality. But there was also a flicker of something else, gratitude, and a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. Reese set the tray down on a nearby table. It held a bowl of broth, a piece of bread, and a cup of water. "Eat," he said simply. "You'll need your strength." Kyle looked at the food, then back at Rhys. The shame hit him then, a hot, suffocating wave. He had come here under false pretenses. He had plotted to kill this man, and this man had shown him nothing but a deep, abiding kindness. He had tended to him through the most vulnerable experience of his life with a respect that Kale still couldn't comprehend. He started, the words catching in his throat. "I was sent to kill you." The confession hung in the air between them, a stark and ugly thing. Rhys didn't seem surprised. He pulled a chair over and sat down, his gaze steady. "I know," he said. Kyle stared at him. "You knew?" "I suspected from the beginning," Rhys clarified. "I knew for certain when I saw the recalibration kit in your pack." He gestured vaguely towards Kale's discarded gear in the corner. "Directorate Tech. Unmistakable." So he had known. He had known Kale was a threat, a spy, an assassin, and he had still followed him into the woods. He had still protected him. The sheer, irrational magnanimity of it was staggering. "Why?" Kyle whispered, the question a raw ache in his chest. "Why would you help me?" Rhys was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes searching Kale's face. "Because when I looked at you," he said finally, his voice soft, "I didn't see a directorate assassin. I saw one of their victims. I saw a stolen child who was never given a choice. I saw the same pain I've seen in dozens of others who've come here seeking refuge. The only difference was that you didn't know you needed one." He leaned forward, his expression intent. "The Directorate's greatest crime isn't the people they kill, it's the people they unmake. They hollow you out and call it peace. They amputate your soul and call it strength. I wasn't helping an assassin, Kale. I was helping a man who was trying to find his way back to himself." The truth of his words settled over Kale, a heavy, comforting weight. He looked down at his hands, at the finger that still held the dormant neurotoxin. A weapon, a function. It felt like a lifetime ago. He slowly, deliberately, extended his right hand, palm up, an offering and a surrender. Rhys looked at his hand, then back at his face. After a beat, he reached out and took it. His grip was warm and firm, his calloused palm engulfing Kale's. There was no fear, only acceptance. At that moment, a faint, cold voice whispered in the deepest recesses of Kyle's mind. Contingency breach detected, asset compromised, initiating Protocol Omega. It was Elara, the neural lace. He had forgotten about the lace. A searing pain shot through the base of his skull, and the world went white. The final contingency was not a supply drop. It was a purge. The pain was absolute. It was not the organic, messy pain of the heat. It was a clean, sharp, technologically precise agony. It was Ilara's final attempt to regain control, a digital exorcism. White-hot fire raced along the neural lace, seeking to burn away the new connections he had formed, to cauterize the parts of his brain that were now responding to Rhys, to the bond, to his own reawakened humanity. He cried out, a raw, strangled sound, and collapsed back onto the bed, his hand ripping away from Rhys's as he instinctively clutched his head. "You belong to the Directorate, Asset 734, Ilara's voice hissed in his skull, no longer a calm command, but a venomous shriek. "You are a function. You will be restored." Images flashed behind his eyes, a high-speed montage of his conditioning. The white rooms, the pain collars, the simulations, the cold, dead eyes of his trainers. It was an attempt to overwrite his new reality, to bury the warmth of the settlement under an avalanche of sterile, cold memories. Reese was beside him in an instant, his hands hovering, unsure of how to help. "Kale, what is it? What's happening?" "The lace," Kale gasped, his teeth clenched against a fresh wave of agony. "She's purging me." Reese's expression hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Ilara," he bit out, the name a curse. He understood immediately. He grabbed Kale's shoulders, forcing him to look at him. "Kale, listen to me. Fight her. She's in your head, but it's your mind. Don't let her take it from you." Fight her? How could he fight the architect of his own consciousness? She was woven into the very fabric of his being. "He is the anomaly," Ilara's voice screamed. "He is the chaos. Purge the connection. Terminate the target. Fulfill your purpose." The command was a physical compulsion. His right hand twitched, his index finger seeking a target. His own body was turning against him again, but this time it was not instinct. It was programming. He fought for control, his muscles straining with the effort. "I can't," he choked out, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's too strong." "No, she isn't," Reese said, his voice a low, powerful rumble. He placed one hand on the side of Kyle's neck, his thumb pressing gently against the pulse point there. His other hand covered Kyle's twitching one, stilling its murderous intent. "She is sterile. She is empty. She feeds on your fear. Don't feed her." Reese closed his eyes. The bond between them, the quiet hum, suddenly surged, becoming a powerful, resonant frequency. The Alpha wasn't just speaking to him. He was pushing his own strength, his own unwavering certainty, down the psychic channel that the heat had forged between them. It was a wave of pure, grounding energy, a wall of scent and presence and will. It slammed into Ilara's cold, sterile code, and for a moment, the pain lessened. Kale gasped, taking in a shuddering breath. He focused on the feeling of Reese's hand on his skin, on the steady, reassuring beat of the Alpha's heart that he could feel through their connection. He used it as an anchor, a focal point in the raging storm of his mind. He pushed back, not with force, but with a simple, powerful act of defiance. He thought of the sunlight on the floor of the sensor station. He thought of the taste of fresh water from the hidden pool. He thought of the sound of a child's laughter. He thought of Reese's sad smile and the weight of his hand on his shoulder. He flooded the neural pathways with the messy, chaotic, beautiful reality of the life he had found here. He met Ilara's sterile code with the rich, complex data of genuine experience. Malfunction. Malfunction. Emotional contamination exceeds tolerable limits. Ilara's presence shrieked, losing its coherence. It was like throwing a handful of soil into a perfect, clean machine. The gears began to grind and screech. Protocol Omega has failed. Asset is lost, initiating systemic failsafe. A new alarm blared in Kale's mind, a terrifying, final siren. And then, a new voice, a cold, automated system voice, spoke through the lace. Sanctuary protocol compromised. Hostile infiltration confirmed. Asset 734 designated as beacon. Activating terminal directive. Kyle's eyes widened in horror. He wasn't just being purged, he was being used. "She's marked the settlement," he gasped, looking at Reese with dawning terror. "The lace, it's a targeting beacon. They're coming." Even as he spoke, a deep, resonant boom echoed from the distance, shaking the very foundations of the longhouse. It was the sound of an explosion. The attack had begun. Reese's face was grim, but there was no panic. He squeezed Kale's shoulder, his gaze unwavering. Then we'll fight them, he said. Together. The choice was no longer a question. It was a reality. Kal had been sent as the agent of this place's destruction. Now he would be its defender. The assassin had to become the shield. The longhouse shuddered as another explosion, closer this time, rocked the settlement. Dust and splinters rained down from the ceiling. The air filled with the acrid smell of ordnance and the distant, terrifying sound of Directorate pulse rifles. Shouts and alarms erupted from outside, a symphony of organized chaos as the settlement's defense protocols kicked in. Rhys pulled Kale to his feet. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice steady amidst the growing pandemonium. Kale nodded, his body weak but his mind shockingly clear. The battle with Ilara had been a crucible. Her presence was gone, severed, leaving behind only the echo of her rage and the horrifying knowledge that his own body was a beacon for the attack. "The lace is still broadcasting," Kale said, his voice urgent. "They can track my position. They'll target the command center. They'll target you." Rhys's jaw tightened. "Finn is already coordinating the defense at the east gate. They'll be expecting a frontal assault." "They won't come from the east," Kale said, his mind racing, falling back on the familiar logic of Directorate tactics. "That's a feint. The explosions are diversions. They'll use the beacon to lead a small, elite strike team directly to the heart of the settlement. They're not here to conquer. They're here to decapitate." His own mission profile thrown back in his face. Termination. Sever the head. He looked at Rhys, the man who was the sole target of this entire, brutal operation. "They're coming for you, and I led them here." A wave of guilt, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. Rhys gripped his arm, his fingers digging in, forcing Kale to meet his gaze. "You didn't lead them. The Directorate did. Now are you going to stand here and drown in guilt, or are you going to use what you know to help me save these people?" The question was a bucket of ice water. Rhys was right. Regret was a luxury they couldn't afford. Kyle's training, his knowledge of Directorate methods, the very things that had made him a weapon, were now their greatest asset. "The strike team will be small," Kale said, his voice hardening, the analyst taking over. 6, maybe 8 operatives, all alpha or beta class, psych-conditioned like me, but without the biological flaw. He ignored the sting of the words. "They'll use stealth and misdirection. They'll move through the chaos, silent and unseen. They'll be heading for the highest concentration of my beacon's signal. Right here." He looked around the chamber, at the maps and communication equipment. This was the nerve center of the settlement. This was the target. "We need to move, now, and we need to lay a trap." Rhys nodded, his eyes gleaming with a fierce light. "What do you need?" "Your trust," Kale said, without hesitation. "And a knife." The next few minutes were a blur of focused activity. Rhys used a communicator to give a series of clipped, precise orders to Finn and the other sector leaders, relaying Kale's intelligence. They would counter the feint at the east gate, but pull their best fighters back to defend the core. Meanwhile, Kale worked with a terrifying efficiency. He grabbed the knife Rhys gave him, a heavy, practical combat blade, and with a grimace, sliced into the flesh at the base of his own neck. The pain was sharp and clean. He dug the tip of the blade in, searching for the subcutaneous transmitter of the neural lace. He found it, a small, hard nodule against his vertebrae, and with a grunt of effort he pried it out, It came free with a sickening squelch of flesh and a shower of sparks. The faint, high-pitched carrier wave in his head went silent. He was truly free. But the beacon was still active. He looked at the bloody piece of technology in his hand. It has its own power source. It will broadcast for another hour. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. They're following the signal, not me. We can use that. He looked at Reese, a plan taking shape. It was a classic misdirection, a tactic straight from the Directorate's own playbook. They would use their own weapon against them. As Reese gathered a small group of his most trusted fighters, a mix of grim-faced alphas and steady, watchful betas, Kale explained the plan. They would plant the beacon on a decoy. They would lure the elite strike team into a kill zone of Kale's own design, a place where the settlement's scrappy, defensive tactics would have the advantage over the Directorate's sterile precision. The place he chose was the workshop, a maze of heavy machinery, spare parts, and flammable materials. It was a death trap waiting to be sprung. As they moved through the settlement, the sounds of battle raging around them, Kale felt a strange sense of belonging. He was running with these people, not from them. He was fighting for them, not against them. The prime alpha, Reese, moved at his side, a reassuring presence of calm authority. They were a strange pair, the escaped weapon and the gentle revolutionary, now united against the system that had created one and sought to destroy the other. The climax was not just a battle for a piece of land. It was a battle for the soul of a man and the future of a people. And it was a battle Kale was finally ready to fight. The workshop smelled of oil, hot metal, and ozone. It was a labyrinth of lathes, presses, and welding equipment, a perfect hunting ground. Kale moved through the shadows, his body remembering its lethal grace, but this time the purpose was different. It was not about termination. It was about protection. He and Reese's small team of fighters took up positions, melting into the clutter of the workshop. Kale placed the still broadcasting beacon on a workbench in the center of the large room, a tempting, obvious target. Then he waited. Silence descended, a pocket of stillness in the heart of the battle raging outside. It was the silence Kale knew best, the held breath before the kill. But this time, he was not the one holding the knife in the dark. He was the one who had set the trap. They came as he knew they would. 6 figures, clad in matte black armor that drank the light, moving with a fluid, synchronized deadliness that was chillingly familiar. They were his brothers, his mirror images, the products of the same sterile, brutal training. They flowed into the workshop, their pulse rifles held at the ready, their movements economical and precise. They ignored the chaos outside, their focus entirely on the pulsing beacon. Kyle watched them from his perch on a high gantry, his heart a cold, steady drum in his chest. He saw their leader, a tall alpha, signal to the others. They were spreading out, forming a classic encirclement pattern. It was the exact maneuver he would have used. He knew their minds, he knew their playbook, and he would use it to tear them apart. Reese gave the signal, a soft bird call that was lost in the din of the distant battle. The trap was sprung. The lights in the workshop cut out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. At the same instant, one of Reese's fighters activated a massive electromagnet, sending a powerful pulse through the room. The Directorate operatives' advanced optical sensors and comms systems flickered and died, blinded and deafened. They were momentarily disoriented, their technological superiority rendered useless. In that split second of confusion, Kale's new allies struck. They were not a synchronized military unit. They were a chaotic, ferocious force. A massive beta, a former miner named Yorn, swung a heavy industrial wrench like a war hammer, shattering the helmet and skull of one operative. Finn, the suspicious guard, moved with a surprising speed, his twin knives a blur in the dark, hamstringing another. They fought with a desperation and a raw fury that the sterile Directorate soldiers could not comprehend. Kale dropped from the gantry, a silent shadow descending into the fray. He landed behind an operative who was struggling to reboot his systems. Kale didn't use a weapon. He used his hands, a sharp, precise strike to the back of the neck, a move designed to sever the spinal cord. The operative crumpled without a sound. It was brutal. It was efficient. It was the way he had been taught. But as the man fell, Kale felt no satisfaction, only a deep, aching sadness. This was another victim, another stolen soul, hollowed out and turned into a weapon. 3 down. The remaining 3 operatives recovered quickly, their conditioning kicking in. They abandoned their useless rifles and drew combat blades, forming a tight, back-to-back triangle. They were outnumbered, but they were far from beaten. The leader, the Alpha, locked eyes with Kyle across the darkened room. There was no recognition in his gaze, only a cold, analytical assessment of a threat. Reese entered the fight then. He was not a whirlwind of violence like the others. He moved with a deliberate, unstoppable force, like a glacier. He met the charge of one of the operatives not with a weapon, but with his body, absorbing the man's momentum and using it against him, driving him into a heavy piece of machinery with a sickening crunch of armor and bone. The strike team leader saw his primary target, Reese, and lunged for him, his blade aimed at the Alpha's throat. Kale moved to intercept, but he was too far away. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the blade arcing towards Reese's neck. He saw the grim determination on Reese's face as he prepared to block the blow. And he saw Finn, the ever-watchful Finn, throw himself in the way. The blade, meant for Reese, sank deep into Finn's shoulder. The beta cried out, stumbling back, but he had bought Reese the second he needed. Reese's hand shot out, grabbing the operative's wrist, and with a sharp twist that spoke of immense strength, he disarmed him. Only one remained, the leader. He stood alone, surrounded, his mission a failure. He looked from Reese to Kale, his helmet's emergency photoreceptors flickering back to life. He stared at Kale, at his face, at the way he stood protectively near Reese. A flicker of something, confusion, recognition, crossed his features. "Asset 734, the operative whispered, his voice a synthesized rasp. "You are compromised." Kale met his gaze. He saw his own reflection in the man's dark visor, the ghost of what he had been. "My name is Kale," he said, his voice clear and steady. The operative raised his blade, a final, desperate act of defiance, a lunge not at Reese, but at the traitor. Kale didn't even flinch. Before the man could take a step, a shot rang out from the doorway. The operative stiffened, a smoking hole appearing in his chest plate, and collapsed. One of Reese's snipers, positioned outside, had taken the final shot. Silence fell in the workshop, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and Finn's pained groans. The battle for the heart of the settlement was over. They had won. Kyle stood amidst the wreckage, the bodies of his former brothers at his feet, the scent of blood and ozone thick in the air. He was covered in grime and blood, but for the first time in his life, he felt clean. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet devastation and resilient hope. The Directorate forces, their elite team eliminated, and their command structure in disarray, retreated as quickly as they had come. They left behind scars on the settlement, blackened craters, splintered buildings, but they had failed to break its spirit. As dawn broke, casting a pale grey light over the clearing, the community was already at work. People were tending to the wounded, clearing debris and sharing what little food they had. The sounds were not of defeat, but of survival, of life stubbornly insisting on continuing. Kale found Rhys near the makeshift infirmary where Finn was being treated. The beta would live. The blade had missed any major arteries. Rhys stood staring at the activity, his face etched with exhaustion and grief for the few they had lost. But beneath the sorrow, there was a deep, unshakable resolve. Kyle walked up to him, stopping a few feet away. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt hollow. "Thank you," felt inadequate. He was the cause of all this, the Trojan horse that had almost brought the walls crashing down. Rhys turned, his grey eyes finding Kale's. He looked at Kale, truly looked at him, taking in the blood and grime, the raw exhaustion and the new, fragile light of selfhood in his eyes. He closed the distance between them, and without a word, pulled Kyle into an embrace. It was not a lover's embrace, nor the embrace of a conquering hero. It was the hug of a survivor, of a comrade. It was solid and real and overwhelmingly grounding. Kyle froze for a second, his body still unaccustomed to such open affection. Then he slowly, hesitantly, relaxed into it. He rested his head against Rhys's broad shoulder, the rough fabric of the Alpha's jacket scratching his cheek, and inhaled the scent of pine and earth and safety. And for the first time since he was a small child, he felt safe. He felt home. They stood like that for a long time as the sun rose higher, casting a warm, golden glow over the wounded settlement. The bond between them was a silent, powerful current, a language that needed no words. It spoke of shared trauma, of a battle won, of a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time felt like it was theirs to choose. When Rhys finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Kale's shoulders, his gaze searching. "What now, Kale?" he asked softly. The question was not about the next battle or the next Directorate threat. It was about him, about his future. The Directorate was gone from his head, but its shadow remained. He was a man without a past, his memories a fabrication, his identity a new and fragile construction. He was no longer Asset 734, the Omega spy. But who was he? "I don't know," Kale answered, his voice raw with an honesty that was still new to him. "For my whole life, I was a weapon waiting for a target. Now, the weapon is broken, and the target is—" He looked at Rhys, at the man he was supposed to kill, the man who had instead given him back his name. "The target is my home." A slow smile spread across Rhys's weary face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made them shine. "Weapons can be reforged," he said. "They can be turned into plowshares or shields. You have a unique understanding of our enemy, Kyle. Your knowledge, your skills, they could help protect this place. They could help us build something better." It was an offer, not a command, a place, a purpose, not one assigned to him, but one he could choose to accept, a path forward. Later that day, Kale stood in Rhys's chambers, which had been his sanctuary during the heat and his prison during Ilara's assault. He looked at his own reflection in a polished piece of metal that served as a mirror. The face that looked back was pale and thin, with dark circles under the eyes. It was the face of a stranger, but it was his face. He touched the crude, healing wound at the base of his neck where he had carved out the beacon. A scar, a reminder. He was no longer a perfect, unmarked instrument. He was scarred. He was flawed. He was real. The door opened and re-centered. He didn't speak, just came to stand beside Kyle, his reflection appearing. Next to Kale's in the metal, the Alpha and the Omega, the leader and the spy, the target and the assassin. They were a study in contrasts, yet they fit together. Two pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The Directorate will be back, Kale said quietly, his eyes on their reflections. They don't forgive defection. They don't tolerate loose ends. Let them come, Reese replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. We were ready for them yesterday. We'll be readier tomorrow. This place, this idea, it's stronger than their system of control. Love is stronger than fear, Kale. Connection is stronger than isolation. He turned from the mirror to look at Kale directly. It's what they'll never understand. It's why they'll ultimately lose. Reese reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of Kale's jaw. It was a simple, tender gesture, an unspoken promise, a beginning. Kale didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, and for the first time, he just breathed. The air was not a recycled null. It was filled with the scent of wood smoke, of healing herbs, of life, and beneath it all, the steady, grounding scent of the Alpha, who had shown him what it meant to be free. The war was far from over, but here, in the quiet of this room, in the steadfast presence of this man, Kale had finally found his peace. He was not a weapon. He was not an asset. He was Kyle, and he was home.